So, welcome. Lovely to see you all here today. And I have to say, I am so happy and excited to be here with Sam Leith to talk about his fabulous book, The Haunted Wood. Sam is in danger of becoming a bit of a national treasure on the British literary scene. He's so multi-talented, and he's written several acclaimed works of non-fiction, very funny novel, poetry, and he was literary editor at the Telegraph, and he's now at the Spectator, where he does an amazing job of steering that august publication away from too much kind of right-wing harumphing.
I do my best.
And he actually also is one of the few people who's probably the envy of their teenage children, as since last year he's written a column on computer gaming as well. Right. So in The Haunted Wood, I think he's produced his most consequential and impressive book to date. It's a history of childhood reading, which also is such an interesting prism through which to look at all sorts of things. A history of how childhood has been perceived over the last 4 centuries, and a sort of history of Britain itself through its bedtime stories. It's so interesting, engaging, and brilliantly funny. I was reading it on the plane on the way over here, and quite crushed together with my fellow passengers, and annoying them all by my strange snorting and honking with laughter. So I really recommend it to you all. Rush, I think there's copies for sale just at the back here. The other thing that this book does is it plunges you right back into that intense pleasure of childhood reading. And probably all of you here, if you're at the JLF, you probably had that experience yourself. I remember, for me, it was sitting under the hairdresser at my mother's, when my mother was sort of having her head baked in one of those old-fashioned hairdryers. And I sat there and I read the first chapter of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And I remember it vividly to this day, that moment where you thought, I had no idea a book could do that. So Sam, actually, I want to start by asking you, what was your moment like that? What was your revelation of the power of reading?
I can't pinpoint a single one, but I do remember a whole series of things that made a huge impression on me very, very young. So Where the World Things Are is one.
So good.
Maurice Sendak's, that sort of mysterious... I think, funnily enough, it was the line breaks of Where the Wild Things Are. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind, a new page, and another, and those sort of frozen tableaus of chaos. And that was a sort of early apprehension of how poetry could work for me.
Yeah.
But I also remember weeping bitterly, aged 8 or 9, at the end of Dennis Watkin Pitchford, BB's Lord of the Forest, which it's a biography of a tree. It was a novel about an oak tree. So, I can't remember how he managed to create so much action and emotion in it, but when the tree finally dies, after 300 or 400 years, it's an oak tree that some interesting things happen to. Kings hide in it when they're on the run from revolutionaries and so forth. Yeah. But I certainly remember, and the last chapter of Robin Hood had me in floods of tears. So realizing that books could make you laugh and make you cry and create a kind of atmosphere or a world. I love that it was Narnia for you, and I know Zadie Smith has described how, as a child, she couldn't go into a wardrobe without going to check the back of it.
I spent years doing that.
They stay with you, don't they?
Yeah. The first surprise for me in this book, I sort of hadn't thought about it, but I vaguely imagined that books directed specifically at children had always been with us. But that was very interesting and surprising to me at the beginning of the book. You realise how late on in British culture there appeared books specifically for children.
Well, yeah, I think the children's stories tend to come out, I think, of an inheritance which is folk tales and fairy stories. The oral tradition gets domesticated, written down as fairy tales in the 1001 Nights or in the works of Perrault or the Grimm brothers. But those initially weren't for children, because children weren't really conceptualized as more than defective adults. And in order to have a kind of children's literature, you needed children who could read, or adults who could read to them, and children who kind of existed in a space where there'd be a sort of separate space for children. And for most of human history, you know, there wasn't a sort of nursery. Children weren't sent to school. So, you know, stories were just stories for adults and children. And it was only when you essentially, and this is probably to slightly scant, you know, hundreds of years of variegated and subtle social history, it's basically when you stopped sending children up chimneys and started sending them to school that, you know, you got an audience for children's literature and a kind of way of conceptualizing children and childhood as something worth having in itself, rather than something you just kind of hurried through to get into the workplace.
I mean, it does make sense, really, when you think how weird lots of fairy stories are, that they weren't directed at children. But and at one point you say, in, you know, typically snappy phrase of Sam's, the basic direction of travel over 3 centuries has been from capsules of cod liver oil to Bertie Bott's every flavoured beans. So, i.e., you know, children's books started off with a strong sense of, you know, we really need to instruct these little monsters how to behave. And then they slowly moved towards entertainment. And actually, I think we should just give Sam some appreciation here, because behind these few, you know, fluent a chapter or so on this subject is, I think, probably days and weeks of labouring in quite dry archives of moralising children's tracts.
Well, I mean, I kind of loved those guys. My editor was a little bit... because we tend to date modern children's literature to about the middle of the 19th century with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Tom Brown's School Days, The Water Babies, which are these books that are kind of fun, that are entertaining and exciting and strange and adventurous. But before that, there was a couple of hundred years when children's literature was in the hands of these... There's another critic who used the phrase, described them as Calvinists of unrelenting severity, which I love. And they were, because they'd taken the idea, they started from the premise that children, sorry, I realise this, you have to hold the microphone right, that the moment they came into the world, children were basically radioactive with original sin. And so the first task of any children's story was to save their souls. And the way you saved their souls was by scaring them silly. So the kind of great example of this is in the sort of 18th century, a nonconformist preacher called James Janeway published a book called A Token for Children. And A Token for Children was essentially an anthology of snuff stories about 14 children, he claimed they were all true stories, who contracted, you know, scurvy or typhus or diphtheria or whatever it was, and died young. And they all go to their graves, their last words are, you know, I'm grateful that I'm dying, for I will meet my Maker soon. And children, do not waste time running up and down upon the Sabbath or playing at knucklebones, but fall to your prayers. Ah! And then they would die, and everyone would cry, and the moral of the story would be pointed out, which was that, you know, playing or having fun or doing anything that we might now expect children to do was a deadly threat to your mortal soul, and that you should follow the example of this other child who went gratefully to his grave. And so you had a couple of hundred years of this, and this was a huge bestseller. This is what they had before they had Harry Potter. So there has been, and remains, there's a sense in all writers for children that children are impressionable, that what you write for them matters in some way. And so those who are scared of children's, you know, going to hell, as they undoubtedly were, thought we have to instruct children to be good. And so that didactic side has always been present in children's literature, and it's still there now. You know, we talk about writing children's stories that give good role models, you know, but children don't necessarily buy into that. And I think there's always a sense in which children vote with their feet, and they'll take out of a story what they find entertaining. The entertainment is always there, and you know, you'll read the Pilgrim's Progress maybe as an adventure story, rather than as a parable of Christian improvement. And so there's a sort of fencing that goes on between what adults want children to take out of a story and what children are actually going to. And the ones that they find fun tend to be the ones that survive.
Well, yeah, so then in the mid-19th century or so, we come to Alice in Wonderland. And I mean, it just is extraordinary what a turning point that seems to be, don't you think? And how original and also how weird. I mean, I don't know, I feel that we probably, it's still so present in our culture, Alice in Wonderland, isn't it? In films and cartoons and images. But when you go back to the text, it's obviously very, very odd, isn't it? But, Sam says a nice thing. He talks about delight in children's books, which is exactly what you just said, isn't it? It's just, the fun which children will seek out and will go after and will demand. And, here we do find it in Alice. Thank goodness, at last.
I think Alice, as you say, it's a weird, weird, weird pair of books. And it's odd because it's obviously hugely important. It's a turning point in the whole history of the genre. Because a lot of it, as I'm sure those of you who know it well will remember, mocks all the moralizing tales that came before. And Isaac Watts' Divine Hymns, which was a kind of very straight-faced, again, book of nursery school moralizing, is ruthlessly sent up with the absurdities of Alice. But it's also a book that in some ways doesn't feel like a children's story at all. And it's so strange in itself that it's hard to see what anything that copies it. I mean, Tom Brown's School Days or those other books that you can see start a genre. Robert Louis Stevenson, the adventure story. You can see other writers taking their cues, but nobody takes a cue from Alice, except in as much as it suddenly just says, we can be silly, we can have fun, we can mock this whole edifice of, essentially that kind of moment when prog rock gives way to punk, and it's just taking the mickey. And so it's incredibly vigorous and quite demented. I mean, I'm sure the children, there's a joke in it about counting in base 31.
Well, I was going to say, something I didn't know that I learned from this book is that Alice in Wonderland is full of incredibly obscure mathematical jokes.
Oh, there's a lovely story, I don't know how true it is, that Queen Victoria really enjoyed Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, because it was very popular when it came out. And she had her flunkies write to Lewis Carroll saying, we'd very much like Her Majesty would like a copy of your next book, please. And she was very bemused to receive in the post about, a year and a half later, a treatise on the contribution of three-dimensional vectors to complex space.
Not what she was hoping for.
No.
Still, she did have Alice Through the Looking Glass at some
Eventually,
point.
I'm sure she got that too, yeah.
So another book about the same date was The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. And I don't know how much that has survived here in India as a text. I mean, it's not very read in the UK now, is it? Or maybe more than I think.
I don't think it is. I mean, I read it when I was growing up, but what I didn't realise is I was reading, as I think many people who still, over the last 50 or 60 years, have read, a sort of very strongly cut-down version.
Right.
Because the original is much longer and much madder, even than Alice in Wonderland.
I mean, I was fascinated and a bit horrified to read, really, of Charles Kingsley's life himself. And it introduces a bit of a theme in your book, doesn't it? Which is that, I mean, the authors of children's books, authors in general have a tendency to eccentricity, perhaps, but the authors of children's books really take it to a new level. And, why? Why is that, do you think?
I mean, it did certainly. It was a great gift for my book that so many of these authors were either had tragic lives or were themselves completely nuts. And I'm sure there are and remain lots of well-balanced children's authors who turn it out beautifully without ever suffering a wrinkle of mental illness or personal tragedy. But I think a lot of the best children's writers have been very troubled. And my sense of why that is that the people who write most feelingly for children are often the people for whom childhood itself seems to be, in some ways, unfinished business. And so quite often you see writers, either they're writing fantasies that are kind of recuperating or imagining a happier childhood than the one they had themselves, or they're writing stories which are an escape from an adulthood that's sort of unbearable into a kind of fantasy world of childhood, or or something that essentially, which is true of Lewis Carroll, I think, the sadness in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is the fact that, you have to leave childhood behind. Alice is going to grow up, except the version of her that's fixed in the pages of that book. And so Kenneth Grahame, who wrote The Wind in the Willows, which is this lovely, hermetic, sunny world, Kenneth Grahame's life was a disaster. He had a horrible time. He had an alcoholic father. He was thrown on the mercy of aunts who didn't like him very much. He had a marriage that was a complete catastrophe. And he created this world that was so obviously a refuge from it. And as has been pointed out about The Wind in the Willows, his marriage was such a disaster, and his sex life was so, let's say, unsuccessful, that in The Wind in the Willows, there are no women, except the washerwoman from whom Toad steals some clothes. It's a completely homosocial world, and it's...
Not the only book which does that, actually. And I do want to talk to you about the problem of, the female sex in a lot of these books. But I was just going to move on from the water babies to, slightly later Victorian times. We come to a real golden age, don't we? When all of these different tropes in children's literature are just appearing one after the other. And I mean, it's, for instance, Treasure Island. It really made me laugh. You saying, okay, here we have all the general paraphernalia of a pirate, one leg, parrot on the shoulder, shouting pieces of 8, X marks the spot. Here they still are in every single book about pirates, aren't they? And, why? So I just wanted to hear what you thought about that. And also just, why is it that, in a way, originality isn't the most important thing about children's stories, is it? It doesn't matter that we get these details reappearing.
No, I don't think it does at all. In fact, I think it obviously the opposite is the case. I say one of my large arguments in the book is that children's stories remain much closer to those kind of basic primal forms of storytelling, which are folklore and myth. And folklore and myth and fairy tales depend on recycling the same material, on retelling the same story over and over again. And children's stories draw strength from their relationship with what comes before, from using those primal narratives that there's going to be a quest. You're going to go into the forest and meet a test, be challenged by a witch or a wolf and come back changed. Or you're going to travel through a portal into a magical other world and come back transformed, or have an adventure. And so these archetypal forms, the fact that these stories repeat again and again, I think gives them great strength and vitality. But as you rightly say, the strangeness in things like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the Water Babies is because they're right at the beginning of a tradition. And basically, people were making it up as they were going along. And it's only as, it starts to become a kind of market and children's stories become something that's more consciously written, that genres emerge, as they do in the grown-up novel. And so you're getting suddenly, as you point out, you're getting the pirate story, which essentially Stevenson doesn't completely invent because there were lots of sort of like penny dreadfuls and sensation pamphlets about Bluebeard and historical pirates. But he basically creates the furniture of the genre with that, and you get people like Kipling, who I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about. He kind of invents or helps invent the school story, or all these genres suddenly start to emerge, and the tale of imperial adventure and all those things. And
yeah, we could talk. We do probably have to talk a little bit about the tales of imperial adventure and Kipling, because there's a couple of problematic things about children's literature of the Victorian and Edwardian period, isn't there? And is it the case? Well, they pervade a lot of imperialist prejudice and racism, basically, didn't they?
Yeah.
As well as patriarchy. And I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Sam? Are there some books that now we would just think aren't suitable for children? We don't really want them reading.
I mean, a good example that I
stuff.
talk about in the book is a guy called G.A. Henty. Now, I don't expect very many people in this audience will have even heard of G.A. Henty. I mean, I may be wrong. Yes, there's someone there who puts her hand up. Now, Henty was, in his era, like one of the best-selling authors for children of his day. He sold millions and millions and millions of copies, and he wrote about 5 books a week. He just churned them out. And these were all tales of imperial adventure, which were absolutely marinated in the kind of racist, white supremacist, imperialist tropes. And, you know, they have vanished. I mean, they were also sort of terrible. I mean, they're sort of trashy, written fast. And they've sort of vanished. I mean, I was able to buy the complete works of G.A. Henty on Kindle for £1.49, which is several million pages.
Quite a bargain.
Quite a bargain, but you don't really want to read the complete works of G.A. Henty. I mean, a dismaying thing to be going through these things. I mean, I sort of knew that Victorian children's writing was going to be racist and sexist and imperialist and all those things. What was dismaying to me was that actually racist and sexist tropes survive in it right up to the 1980s. I mean, you know, you're kind of, it's really quite recently, shockingly recently, that, you know, any consideration really is given to people of colour and being centred in these stories at all. I mean, I think that someone like Kipling's a really interesting example, because I would stick up for Kipling a bit, and I'd be really interested to know from a perspective of Indian people whether Kipling is how he's seen now, because he was undoubtedly a full-throated and believing imperialist. But he wasn't, I don't think, quite as simply a white supremacist as is, you know, as is sometimes put. I mean, I think he was a very subtle writer, a subtle thinker, and though much, you know, there are lines from The White Man's Burden that have been rightly used to hold him up for cancellation. But he was profoundly, you know, all of his characters are in between two worlds, and the virtues of so many of his characters is their deep sympathy with the subject peoples of empire and their ability to speak the local language, to pass among the people. You know, he didn't have this idea, sort of Sahib's eye view, that, you know, the subject peoples of empire were just like an undifferentiated mass of savages.
It's much more subtle, but perhaps we can, when we get on to questions, we might hear more about that. And also, from my point of view, I had quite elderly parents, and I read an unbelievable diet of Victorian children's books directed at girls. And I think it took me decades to shake off the sort of super demure advice that I was given. Maybe it's still there a bit, I don't know. And then I found with my own daughter, I found myself, you know, skipping bits and changing the lines and giving the girls better lines. I mean, they went through a period, my daughter went through a period of liking Enid Blyton, and, you know, definitely had to parcel out the lines to the girls a bit more.
I quite like that sort of solution to the question of should we cancel these books or should we quietly rewrite them? And it's become a culture wars issue, at least in the UK. I don't know how much that's true of India. But, you know, parents have always just skipped over that line or that paragraph or slightly altered it when reading. And I think that's okay. These stories, as I said, are very robust to being retold. And it's not simply an innovation that they get cancelled. There's a subplot, a white-faced subplot in the first book of Hugh Lofting's otherwise very innocent Dr. Dolittle stories. And actually, for decades, subsequent editions have just kind of quietly taken that out because you don't lose much from the story to take it out. It's offensive, it's of its own time. And I think that's the equivalent of a publisher doing what a parent does when they skip over 2 lines in Enid Blyton, and I think that's okay. I think these texts aren't sacred, and the ones that still have something good in them, you can skip over.
They're not sacrosanct, are they? I mean, also when you hear, I can't remember who it was, but the speed at which a lot of them were written, you think, come on, we can edit a little bit here if we want.
I think there's also a sense with the stuff of the 1930s and 1940s when they're talking about Africa or India or South America or the western part of the United States. Children's stories are so often about having an adventure over there, somewhere else. It's through a portal, it's in another country. And to the reading audience of British children's stories in the 30s, other countries, be they imperial possessions or whatever, were over there. They were somewhere exotic. And I think the sort of othering of the native people was invariably, it was kind of a piece with the othering of the landscape and the food, and it was just, you go over there, and there are people who look different from us, and they talk different from us, and they, and it's like lions and tigers and bears, oh my. They were othered because to the audience they were other.
Yeah. There's just so much to talk about, Sam, isn't there? But I'm going to shoot ahead because I think we can't have this session without talking about the great publishing sensation of our time. I recently saw a clip of a Korean animated version of Harry Potter. And I just thought, the boy wizard's global domination has been achieved, hasn't it? And they're extraordinary, really, because they draw together so much of what we've said, haven't they? They recycle many of the tropes. They draw on these fairy tale, archetypes. But, their critics attack them for sort of being simplistic and, having lack of originality. But they just have caused such devotion, and they're billions of admirers, haven't they? Why?
Yes.
Have they been the ones to unite the world?
I mean, I'm sure there's a bit of luck involved, but I think people who say, the prose isn't very impressive, are sort of missing the point. The world is full of people who write unimpressive prose. Why is it that this author of unimpressive prose has done so well? And I think some of that's to do with the world building. Yes. A lot of it's to do with the plotting and pacing. She's very good at, telling a story, which is what children really want. But J.K. Rowling was a great gift to me in writing this book, because if you're trying to write a kind of Whig history of children's literature that builds up to something, she's great, because she's this huge inflection point at the genre that's quite recent, but not so recent that I have to write about David Walliams as well. And because she's such a magpie, there are all these, she essentially, and again, people attack her for unoriginality, but I think that is completely to miss the point. She is unoriginal because she goes, look, here's the boarding school story. It's basically been dead for 50 years. I'll reinvent it. And here's a little bit of the sword in the stone, Wart growing up to be King Arthur, man of destiny. And, here's Cinderella, and here's the Jesus Christ story. And here's, the sacrificial redemption that Harry goes through. And here's an ancient Russian folktale that turns into the Horcruxes. And she's got the wizarding school, and she's taken the kind of bestiary of a Tolkien and the portals and she essentially just takes everything she fancies from the whole history of children's literature and bundles it up and makes it new. And it works because the reason those were so popular through children's literature is because their kids love them. So I think,
Why the boarding school, do you think? Because, that is, I think of that as a kind of strange British institution that most of the rest of the world has been sensible enough to avoid. But somehow it just works in a children's story, doesn't it?
I think it does. The boarding school story has been a big fixture of English children's literature since, the end of the 18th century, actually. But the main, it does what all children's stories need to do, which is get the parents out of the way. And my old friend Piers Torday, who's a very good children's writer himself, once said to me that he thought there should be a national day of remembrance in which all children's writers would sit and hold a solemn moment's silence for all the parents who they'd killed off on page 1. Because either you have to have the parents killed. You'll notice there's a preponderance of orphans in children's stories. So either the parents are killed, like Roald Dahl has them eaten by a rhinoceros, or you have the parents, they're in India, running a colonial administration, and their kids, the child is in London, as happens in Frances Hodgson Burnett's A Little Princess, or in some of Kipling. Or you have the children being taken away to sea on a pirate ship, or they go to a boarding school, or as now, they fall through the back of a wardrobe or a rabbit hole. Because basically having your parents around ruins everything. You can't have an adventure with your parents around. You can't get into even mild peril with your parents around. So the parents have to be got rid of. And the boarding school, which, there are adventures, there are hijinks, there are authority figures who can be defied, and there are rules, because so much children's literature is about children negotiating with rules and learning how much you can break them and having fun being naughty, and a boarding school is the perfect place for that.
Great. And also, we've mentioned Narnia. We haven't mentioned The Hobbit, another just absolutely massive classic. And obviously J.K. Rowling also takes quite a bit from that, doesn't she? The quest and the Norse images. And you say...
And the forest. I think Mirkwood is there. The Whomping Willows are a definite Tolkien lift.
Exactly. And somehow I think that, you say an interesting point, I think, which is just the grand, both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, you point out, is a return, surprisingly, right at the end of this talk, to the cod liver oil pills we talked about right at the beginning. There's a bit of a moralizing strain in there as well. And you write about it really well, I think.
Oh, thank you. I think Tolkien, Lewis certainly had a real design upon the reader. It was what A.S. Byatt described to me as Christian arm twisting. I think Tolkien was more... Tolkien was so weird. He was more interested... He essentially wrote The Lord of the Rings in order to design the language. He was more interested in the world building than in the story. And The Hobbit, he was kind of like, let's get some Elvish in here. And the two of them, Lewis and Tolkien, as I'm sure many of you know, they're great mates. They were both, I think, Tolkien had a son. But they basically sat in this pub in Cambridge in a fug of cigar smoke and the pong of spilled beer, and decided that children's stories weren't traditional enough because they should be much more based on, Old Norse legends. And so they're really conscious, both of those stories, of drawing on the mythic tradition.
And didn't they wanted children's stories to be about duty and honour and courtesy and chivalry.
Chivalry, which is very present in The Hobbit, I think.
It's a sort of grandeur, which I think also infuses Harry Potter and gives it some of its kind of... It feels so large, it feels on a vast scale.
But another of the things Harry Potter does brilliantly, I think, when you're talking about it feeling large, is it grows with its audience. It's published year by year by year, and I think if you're probably now about 30, you would have grown up with the Harry Potter books being published when you were about the same age as Harry. And so the first book isn't very large. The world is very safe, and Hogwarts is an enclosed and bounded space, and what's happening is sort of bounded by the school holidays. There's an adventure in each term. And as the books go on, that starts to kind of break down, and more is at stake, and more characters bite the bullet. J.K. Rowling's fantastically slap happy with killing off her characters. In the first book, I think somebody's mildly injured and then brought back to life. By book 4, there's a kind of body count in the high teens.
Sort of operatic.
And then by the end, the final book, she just kills off 3/4 of the characters practically. But it is sort of growing up. The stakes are higher. Suddenly there's politics, and there's a world outside the school terms, and the school itself is no longer safe because it gets taken over by the Death Eaters. so I think there's a lot of artfulness, and even in these quite, in some ways, simple stories, there's a certain amount of kind of wisdom and care in the way that transition's managed, I think.
So just one last point to finish off before we have questions. That, you know, in the 60s and 70s, you suddenly get this huge anxiety about television. And is television going to kill off reading? And are children's brains going to be turned to mush? And of course, you know, that then developed into anxiety about screen time. And probably before that, they were anxious about the radio. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they were.
Yeah. So,
and the theatre.
And the theatre.
It goes right back.
Ruining children's minds. So, and actually, you do end the book, Sam, with a bit rather sad statistics on children's reading being much lower than it used to be. So, I mean, what's your feeling? Is it going to pick up and keep going, or is it going to end as it started?
I don't
Surely
know.
not.
No, predictions is odious. But I have a hope that it can and will survive, because I remain convinced that whatever the virtues and narrative excitements available through video games and television and film and all the other competitors we have, there is something that a dead tree book or a basic traditional narrative in words can give you that isn't available elsewhere, in terms of your access to characters, the interiority, the kind of ability to inhabit and flesh out a world yourself. And I think once you get it, you know, it's always there for you. But undoubtedly, there are competitors. And, you know, we adults see it as well. You know, I mean, I think many adults would say they read less than they would have in the past because they're always checking their phones.
True.
And so one thing I try and encourage is, if you've got young children, read to them, because not only will it mean that they're not on devices, but nor are you. And the cognitive work that reading does will be reinforced by the emotional work that having mum or dad's undivided attention does as well. You know, you are, in that moment, in Kipling's words, best beloved.
Oh, quite right. Okay, thank you so much, Sam. It's such a wonderful book. There's so much in there that we haven't had time to discuss. But let's hear. Has anyone got questions in the audience? What about this lady here? Saw her arm first.
Sam, you spoke about editing outlines from Enid Blyton's stories. Wouldn't that be censorship? And why do it? Why not encourage children to read a wide variety of stories and to ask questions?
I don't know it's exactly censorship. I mean, I suppose it is. I mean, I don't have a huge problem personally with saying, you know, there are some, you know, language that we consider racist or sexist. I mean, for an older child, absolutely. I'm not saying we should remove these books from libraries, expunge them from the historical record. And, you know, absolutely, you can have a conversation with children about that. I was writing about 10 years ago, I was writing an article about a reissue of Hergé's Tintin in the Congo, which you'll probably, if you know it, it's got very, very sort of racist blackamoor characterizations in the illustrations. And I was very encouraged that my then, I think she must have been 7 or 8-year-old daughter, who's here in the audience today, she came and saw me reading it. She said, "What the hell's that? That's outrageously racist." And I said, "Well, this is quite good. These things have seeped through." So I agree with you about, you know, using these texts as a way of having a conversation with older children about the attitudes of the past. I equally sympathize with, when you're reading to a younger child, with Charlotte's thing that maybe you just want to skip over that bit and have the conversation later. But it's a live debate, and I respect different positions on it. I wish it hadn't become a kind of culture war issue.
Good. Anyone who else? Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, my question for you is ki, why do you think that many children as well as adults feel that reading is such a task instead of considering it a reward? And what do you think that childhood reading experiences shape the relationship an adult can have with their books?
So the question is, why does children see it as a chore rather than a pleasure?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's because they've got the wrong books. I mean, I think, this thing we were talking about, the long swerve and tug of war in the history of this genre between the cod-liver oil merchants, the kind of idea that children's books should be improving, and the people who are saying, children's books should be fun. The cod-liver oil merchants lose out because if you try and force a book on a child that you think is going to be improving for it, unless there's something in there that the child delights in, it's not going to work at all. And as long ago as John Locke and the Enlightenment, there was this understanding that if you want to teach children, you teach them through their appetite for play. So I'm very conscious that you have to go to where the children are. So my youngest, for instance, my youngest son, who's now just turned 11, he took a while to get interested in chapter books, in just continuous prose. But he loved the sort of comics. And so, I just gave him comics. And sooner or later, he started to move on and show curiosity. And a lot of the time, if children aren't ready for classics, don't give them classics. Give them something that makes them laugh. Give them something that's got, like toilet jokes in it. I think delight. I mean, I now make my living writing about serious literary fiction. But when I grew up, what I devoured was Nancy Drew adventures and Marvel comics and all sorts of stuff that would have been seen as trash. But I think it's, if you're enjoying it, that's what keeps you reading. So I think that's the important thing.
We just got time for one more. Sorry? Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by saying that, often people ask you, who's that one person you'd like to have dinner with? And I never had an answer. Now I'd like to say both of you. I'd love to have dinner with both of you one day. Anyway, what I do want to say is that I'm putting you on the spot because we're at JLF and this is the only children literature session that we've had in 5 days. And so as a person who's been saved by books when I was a child and as a person who's still saved by children fiction as an adult, I'd like you to make an appeal to JLF's powers that be to have more children books represented, more children authors represented in coming years. So if
I would give that my wholehearted support. And when I bump into that nice Mr. Dalrymple, I will bop him on the head and say more stuff about children's literature. And maybe that will give me an excuse to force him to invite me back. So.
Two more questions. Two more questions. So we got.
Why did children's literature flourish in England but not in France? That's one. And what do you think of Arthur Ransome, about whom we didn't discuss anything today?
Oh, yes. Well, it's a very good question why it's flourished more in England than in France. And it's one I'm very ill-equipped to answer because I'm not an expert on French literature or the history of... I think children's literature was a great export for the UK. And I think some genres, like boarding school stories and tales of imperial adventure, for very obvious reasons, came from, flourished in the UK because we had both those things. But honestly, I just don't know. I'm sure there are lots of good children's stories in France, but I'm afraid I'm not an expert on that. And Arthur the Ransom, I might disappoint you. I don't love Swallows and Amazons as much as many people do. But I do sort of love Arthur Ransome's demented story because he had, as I write in the book, he went off to Russia and he had an affair he had a terrible first marriage, as many of them did, and then he went off to Russia and had an affair with Trotsky's secretary and may have been spying for the Russians on the British or may have been spying for the British on the Russians, but certainly was up to no good. And his wife called him Charlie. Second wife was rather horrible to him as well and called him Charlie Chaplin because whenever his hemorrhoids had a particularly bad attack, he'd kind of waddle along like Charlie Chaplin. So I see him as a richly comic figure. But I know there are lots of people who love swallows and Amazons, and I respect their love for it, but never really quite did it for me.
He was quite good on girls, at least. He gave the girls a bit of a look in, didn't he?
Oh, he does, actually.
Yes.
To his great credit, he does
Yes,
give the girls a
one of
look
the
in. They
few.
win the competition, don't they?
Well, all right, that's it. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming, for your wonderful questions.
Thank
And a
you.
huge thank you to Sam. And he's going to be here signing his books. So I hope you'll all come and buy one and talk to him.
Thank you.
you.